Hello, welcome to the Unconference Day 2, Track 2, Tea Time slot. Track 2 is, of course, the edgy alternative track where the cool kids hang out, and I'm your host, Marc Goodson, an honorary cool kid for the next half an hour. We'll be talking to the speakers from the last 4 talks of Track 2 and putting to them the burning questions that you, the dear listeners, have typed carefully into the Q&A box during the talks. Hopefully you've seen an Unconference session before by now, so you know the drill. This will be a little like those. It's the same panel format, except with me saying a lot and nobody being quite sure who I've asked the question to. There'll be a prize if we manage a 2-minute period of awkward silence. But first, introductions. We haven't rehearsed this, but everybody will need to wave when I say their names. We have with us today Phil Whittaker, Sam Flanagan and Lisa Matthews from the Perspectives on Content Modelling talk, and John Pryor from the Putting the User Experience Back into the Digital Experience Stack talk, Carl Sargunar from the almost open source software nirvana running Umbraco on Linux and for fun and profit, and finally Markus Johansson from 10 Things Every Umbraco Developer Should Know. Great talks, one and all, and I'm sure you have your favourite. I have mine, but I can't say, you know, like when you have your favourite child but you can't admit out loud who it is. Anyway, the questions. And I was using an auto cue. There you go. It's clever, isn't it? Thanks for joining us and welcome. Really good talks, really informative and enjoyable. We've got some questions. I think that's what's happening now. I ask you a question, you answer it. First one we've got in is from Ken Billingsgate. For Lisa, I think would be best to start this off, if that's okay. I really enjoyed your analogies with poetry, and if we are all silent, I do have a poem written out of all Umbraco packages names, which I can perform at the end if we run out of time. Or maybe you should keep talking.
No, you have to do that now. You can't say that and not do it.
But I was really interested in the way that you have the sort of synergy between developers and the content creating. And I wondered, in that scenario, who names the doc types? How do you name things? How do you agree on what things should be called?
Mainly we don't. I mean, I think naming and sort of nomenclature, all that sort of thing is one of the major challenges that we all have, actually. And I think sort of one of the 101s of content is, you know, consistency and congruence, so that like sort of in our team and Nexo are trying to work towards that in terms of having consistency and congruence. But, you know, it's a challenge because we're all coming from different disciplines and different backgrounds. And so it's a great question. And I think it's what I mean, I struggle with it myself in my own practice because I have different areas of practice. So I name them different things. And I think that resonates outwards towards the bigger team I'm part of, and, you know, all of us as professionals, really. So I think it would depend on, sometimes it's being the dev, sometimes it's being me, sometimes if you argue tooth and nail over it and come to some compromise in the end. But it's always a challenging area, actually. It's interesting that I think I don't know whether it's perceived as something that's easier, that naming's easy, but whenever you come down to it, when you do content, yeah, absolutely. And when you do content sort of in governance and governance work, you know, and you're working on a whole ecosystem with, you know, thousands and thousands of docs, we usually always come back to naming and nomenclature in the end. So I think it's a massive area. And one of the reasons I'm interested in it as a writing scholar as well as a content designer is that we all use words and language. And I think it's another way for us to look at this whole area, if you like. So that's kind of what I think at the moment, but it's an ongoing struggle.
I thought you were going to say, as a poet, I know exactly how to do it, and this is how we do it. We're all like, come on, tell us. But yeah, just come from
don't ask a poet for anything. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, poetry has to be incredibly targeted and specific as well, and especially in a formula. If you're writing to a formula, you'll get ripped to shreds if your formula is not right and if it's syntactically incorrect. And fair enough, you know, that's what we have forms for. But it's a real challenge. It's not in more creative work, because basically you can just say what you like and call it art, you know. I mean, I'm being a bit flippant, but, you know, you can.
You've seen some of my Umbraco installs.
But, I think what I was saying in the talk is that I see, I'm not a dev, my partner's a dev, but I don't understand what devs do. I think you're all magicians and I think it's magical, but actually people say that when they watch you in a creative process. So I just think all of the resonances are interesting.
There's a real synergy between like stage magicians and writing code, because it is literally, you cannot see what they're doing, and and we are distracting people, and then suddenly, the image loads or it resizes or it works, and it's quite a good feeling. It's quite a good reveal. That said, I wouldn't take a website down for several days and when it came back up and go, ta-da! That would be bad. I would be taking magicians too far. Good. Anyone else got any insights on naming things? Anything else you do across the board?
Just to follow that on, really, especially in larger projects, it's one of the most important things is agreeing a key language, because not everyone in the project is going to be a dev, not everyone in the project is going to be creative. You might have business people on there, and if you can't agree a key language beforehand, you're not going to communicate ideas well, you're not going to communicate problems well, but having that in place beforehand is so important. Just that was the only point I wanted.
Yeah, and I think the devs.
I think that's one of the first things that we do when we see a wireframe, when we see something, is we decide what the blocks are going to be, what the components are going to be, as a collaborative process with people like content designers, because it's really important that everybody kind of understands what those are, and it goes as parallel lines throughout the entire system. Otherwise, it just won't stand up.
You've got those bugs that come in that say, I've got a problem with widget number 3. What?
Widget number 3 is quite a low number. But yeah, I've worked at council before with Kevin Jumper. We used to it wasn't so much stopping developers from naming things, but it was just trying to talk about it with the editors at the point of naming, because the developer's intent is to get the thing to build and get it out the door, whereas the editors have got to live with it for the rest of their lives. And the other thing I found really useful, which I don't know if anyone has done from this, we all build sites, but do you get the editors that are going to use the product, and do you train them first before you build a site and deliver a finished site, so they actually understand what Umbraco can do, and they can say things like, we want a nested content section for that, because it's often the editors really that should be designing the interactions and the things, because they're the people who need to deliver the content to provide the business value. I don't know.
Absolutely. It's like any part of the project. The content modeling isn't just something that you start and it's done at the end of it. Naming your content is an iterative process throughout. You start it, you get some key concepts down, and that's a really important phase of the project right at the start, because that is something that you may choose a name for something at the start of it, but actually whilst you're working with that content and while you're populating it, you might find actually this isn't quite the right fit for it. I want to change that. If you've gone ahead and modeled everything at the start, started building views, started populating everything, changing that is a nightmare. Developers are going to be massively against doing that. But if you can have that communication and the iterative agile process of going, okay, let's have a few whacks at this. Let's try something. Try and put some content in there. Put some real data. Put some real ideas into this. You get a much better view for all of it, and then.
I think that's why it's really important to kind of work together on it. And to try and think from the person that's using it perspective. So we've stopped using words like hero to describe, because that's an industry word more than anything, and it's taking it from their perspective rather than from your perspective. So it's about being very descriptive around it as well.
I think that what we do and what I really like is to have like the client involved in this part of the process and making sure that they are available. So sometimes when I sit and code, or I just grab the phone and call the client and like, how would you call this? What is this for you? And make sure that the code and what we call it in Umbraco, everything aligns, like something like the DDD ubiquitous language thing. That's the holy grail for us. Not always there, but that's like how I like to work.
I think it's a tough subject in Umbraco, because the inability to refactor the implementation of the doc types after you've got 20 million blog posts in there. It's not impossible. You can do it all via SQL. It's good fun. I recommend it. But how often do people go back after an editor has lived with it for 6 months and sort of measure and find out what the pain points are? Quite often it's seen as a kind of a one-off. We built the site, there you go, bye-bye. But in reality, all the content modeling in the world, and I don't know whether Sam will come and say, no, content modeling is best. It goes out the window when people start to use things and find workarounds for their own workflows. And measuring editors achieving tasks is a fascinating insight.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just the first question, and we've done 15 minutes, so we must ask other people things. We have another question, which again is content modeling driven, but many companies seem to go through an endless, this is from Phil Gilligan, many companies seem to go through an endless cycle of website rebuilds with radical and often seemingly random changes to the way the content is modeled. Do you think that investing more time in content modeling could drive better ROI by allowing website redesigns to take place without continually reinventing the content model? I guess, Sam, this ties in with what you were talking about with defining content models to allow them to be flexibly used. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, I must apologise if the connection's bad. My internet's a bit dodgy at the moment. But yeah, I think this is I think if I understand the question correctly, I think this is where sometimes you see sites being rebuilt, including the redesign, and at the same time sort of redesign the content model, and then you rather than sort of starting with a content model and then that is something that can exist independently of the design. And I think that where this is coming from is the perspective of headless CMS, where there is more upfront investment in the content model simply because it's entirely separated from the presentation. You can't do the presentational aspect. So I think that from this is the sell for the headless CMS, that it's you have a sort of authoritative content model for the enterprise, and you can go through multiple redesigns of the presentation side, but your content model, it's not that it doesn't change. I mean, it can be refined and refactored. Of course it does, as you get a better understanding of the domain. You will want to change the model. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's if you talk about ROI or return on investment, it's if you can break the chain between the redesign of the content model and the redesign of the presentation, so that you're just tackling them separately, you perhaps get better results.
John, your fancy framework, your wonderful diagrams, which I enjoyed tremendously, does that help with that kind of the content modeling approaches and sort of identifying up front your approach to see where components live, that identifying of headless or not headless or Uno, all that? It's quite interesting how you sort of analyze that.
So I think part of this really from the perspective that I've been looking at it is that content as well as technology is going to update all the time, because user needs are changing. The way people are using the tools available changes, the way people talk about those tools changes, the type of functionality available changes, and how things are being done in other systems elsewhere, which influence how people experience approach your sites and the experiences you build change too. So, to take a really kind of obvious example, but if you think back 20 years when the shopping basket became suddenly the model that everyone used to start understanding the e-commerce model, and that came out of a few sites starting to do it, but then every other site adopted that model because it was what users were growing to understand. So there's really valid reasons for needing to be able to keep updating how you're modeling and delivering content, not just based on how you're looking at your own users, but how the environment around you is changing. So yeah, that flexibility really needs to be built in as much as you can to the concept. You don't want to get into a position where you're re-implementing your system because actually we need to model content a slightly different way, and we've hard-coded some concepts that are very hard to unhard code out.
Do you, with your process, try to map how the lifetime of components with the solutions, something like the sort of Wardley mapping technique, of where you would map sort of the value of a particular component against its its commodity as to how easy it is to sort of procure that solution when you're putting those things together. I don't know if you've.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the complexity of the solution. In a lot of cases, you might analyze a particular solution on kind of hub and spoke model, for example, where your hubs are kind of core systems which are fairly hard to change because you've got so many spokes radiating off them, but individual spoke is quite easy to change because it's only got one integration in or out. And all that starts to come back to, core concepts around how tightly coupled your integrations are. And, basically, do you manage to localize them to a particular point where it's easy to separate them out again? Part of the process of managing change is making sure you're keeping track of that, because it's very easy to kind of approach from a runaway model of actually it's just easy to send this from here to here, and then kind of forget that you've got that direct integration until a point where you try to replace your main integration and then something falls over because actually there was a connection between two different systems that everyone had forgotten about that was just quietly running in the background.
Yeah, they're the forgotten systems, aren't they, that tie things together and then are obsolete suddenly.
And obviously that's where, kind of iPaaS as a segment, etc., starts to help with that. But you've still got to put the legwork into making sure that the modeling you're putting into those integration systems, whether they're traditional middleware or iPaaS or what have you, are tying everything together. Those are the delivery vehicles that give you the flexibility, but you still got to put the brain work into making sure that you're designing for that flexibility.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Was hoping you'd say something which allowed me to segue into talking about Umbraco 9 onto Linux, but
sorry.
So change, yeah, it's about managing change. Oh, Umbraco 9, making it possible to run on Linux. That's really interesting. Carl, do you think that being able to run Umbraco on Linux is a bit of a game changer? Do you think it will bring different kinds of developers in? Will we as a community have a whole new branch?
Yeah, it feels like, you move a room in a cupboard and move your sofa and you find a door, and then suddenly behind there's this whole other wing of the house that you didn't know was there. There's a whole other ecosystem of tools and developers that we in the .NET community sometimes don't really get involved with on that side of things. So there's definitely a lot of other stuff that we can do, but it's really difficult to say. It's still really early days. Having those barriers taken down is absolutely a game changer, but it's not just Linux. This could lead to Umbraco on your fridge at one day if you wanted to. But the fact that .NET 5 and 6 and kind of going forward is going to basically be single platform, single framework, multiple platform, multi-targeting. It is very, very exciting on the developer side of things. Difficult to see where we'll go, but yes, almost certainly. Game changing.
Umbraco on your fridge would be the coolest thing.
That's it.
Not as cool as a freezer, but sorry, I'm in dad mode. You've got some technical questions about your talk. Okay. So I don't know how easy or quick they are to answer. We probably don't have time to answer them all in great detail, but I'm sure these people can contact you direct. But one question from Alex Leach is, how are you able to build and run .NET framework on Linux with VS Code? ?
Using the .NET SDK. There's plenty of documentation online, but if you wanted to get in touch on Twitter, I'm quite happy to send you some links which will help you. The other great resource is the Microsoft Learn website, which has a huge amount of free online learning. You can go and basically do that. Yeah, it's like command line.
Yeah, we've got Jason Elkin asking, how did you find configuring Nginx as opposed to IS?
Surprisingly straightforward, actually. Just to get the basics. I mean, I did not configure a production-ready environment. I configured a proof of concept. So for that side of things, yes, it's really simple. I wouldn't recommend anyone take my talk as a guideline for how to host a production environment in any way, shape, or form. But yeah, it was actually really well documented, pretty straightforward, because everything in Linux is a configuration file. Everything is somewhere. You just go and edit the file, restart the service, and bang, you're done. Whereas in Windows, things can be hidden away sometimes. You don't know particularly which UI button to click and which element to kind of look behind. So in that respect, yeah, I think actually it's and that's leads on to one really good thing with the future of kind of .NET and .NET 5 and 6. Get familiar with the command line. It's something that .NET developers traditionally have always stayed away from. People like UIs, and that's absolutely fine. If you like UIs, stay with your UIs. Do what's comfortable with you. But don't ignore the command line, because there's a lot there that you can do that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do as easily with just a UI tool.
It is also tremendously exciting when you type something in the command line and the screen just goes up with lots of data and it's at the end.
I'm in the matrix.
Is anyone else on the panel excited about Linux as an option to Umbraco 9? How who's been keeping an eye on it?
Yeah, I've had a play around with it. I've not had a play around the beta, but I've had a look at the alpha side. I've started migrating some of my stuff across to .NET Core as well, and it was surprisingly easier than I thought it was going to be, which was nice and a pleasant surprise considering how things have been in the past. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in terms of hosting as well, and better options around that, and more stable options sometimes as well.
Yeah, I think there's some really brilliant talks during Codegarden about this, and I think the documentation is 2,000 miles further forward than it was moving to V8. Selfishly, sort of saying that, but people have written talks and slides. The more we can get into the documentation, the better people's experiences. It's about discovering it, and it's great to have it on people's blogs, but the documentation is the place where people look first. And we've even been trying to link out from the documentation to people's blog posts. So any threads on any talks, please.
There was a series of meetups as well a couple of weeks ago that was really good. I didn't get a chance because lots of other things happened. If you could run those again, that would be amazing to be able to get to some of those or
you'll have to ask Emma.
Yeah,
Emma and Carol. I can't answer the question. Okay, we're running out of time now, but let's switch to Markus. And the first question I need to ask is, which is from me, what's the highest number of versions you've ever discovered in a property data table on a Umbraco site that you've inherited?
Oh my God, that's a good question. I'm actually not sure if it's one of the inherited projects. We've had a couple of websites that's really content heavy that didn't run on version until a couple of years ago. I don't have an exact number, but I think we stripped around like 1.5 gigs of versions from the website a couple of weeks ago. So it's something that, well, yeah, it happens, and it's kind of hidden. So it's good to be aware that these versions get created and they're stored forever. Maybe that's something you want, or maybe it's not, but it's good to know that they are there.
Mine's 11.5 million.
Is that true?
Site was slow in the back office. It was an Umbraco 6 site. But yeah, it's almost like when people get in touch saying we've got a slow Umbraco site. Like, how long have you had it? Do you import anything into the system overnight? So yeah, it's a really, really big gotcha. So that's what I enjoyed about your talk, is that it's going through those things, and from your experience, kind of the things that you are hitting or reporting back. And I guess that from my point of view, a lot of these sort of come up time and time again each year, and it's just like how can we teach people? How can we let people know about these kind of things that are like secret, almost gotchas? I don't know if anyone's got opinions on that.
That's never hard was one of those things that's been around for such a long time that yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the training, of course, is a place where people will learn it, but it's a challenge because people just want to get started, and we want to get it as easy as possible to get started. And then these problems tend to come up after a site grows for a while. So you
never Google, what are the best things to do to stop my Umbraco site slowing down with versions? Yeah,
you tend to go into something, especially talking about documentation as the solution of everything. But if you have a problem, I think many people tend to read the documentation until you solve the problem, and maybe then stop reading it. So the gotchas has to be clear in the documentation, maybe. But at the same time, it's not the silver bullet either. It's a hard one.
We tried to tackle it with the anti-patterns document that Shannon wrote following the talk I did a few years ago about anti-patterns. Learn by don'ting. But even that's out of date because it's for V7 and it says things like definitely use XPath. And it's like, well, actually, no, for 8, you probably don't want to use XPath.
Exactly, yeah. No, it's outdated. But it is, and it was a really good article.
Yeah.
I know Shannon talked about it in the version 9 side of things, and version 9 is and 10 and kind of going forward is an opportunity to address some of these kind of Umbraco historic peculiarities that have always been there from the early days, that have just always been baked into it because that's the way it's always been done. If we're talking about breaking changes anyway, if we're talking about new platforms and new structures, this is a good opportunity to actually say, let's start with probably a better stable platform. So more of that, please.
Good stuff. So you have specific questions, but as your session finished just as this started, I'm just reading them now. There's quite a few specific questions, but I think they're aimed more at the core, and we don't have anyone who can answer from the core. Things like, why isn't super value converters adopted in the core? Appreciate it's a breaking change, but it'd be a worthwhile one. Do we agree with that? Is that?
Yeah, I think that there's room for improvements in how the core property value converters work, but I also think that Column raised the awareness for that by creating that package. But it would be a breaking change, and I think that it's something that you would opt into, and you don't want your site to break on upgrade just because this was introduced into the core site.
That's good. There is now, wearing a HQ hat for a second, there are now GitHub discussions enabled on GitHub, and one of the topics being discussed at the moment is improving that experience for working with, pulling property and data back from Umbraco. Those APIs, can we make them friendly again? And super value converters is mentioned on that as one of the things that, could we pull it in for 9? Could we start rethinking the way we're doing that?
I think that's a good idea.
Cool. And then another direct question via Piotr is models builder modes. Why did you decide to use the models builder, or what models builder mode would you definitely use, and why did you decide to use it? It's probably a better way of phrasing that.
So we tend to use live app data, or is it app data live, or the naming is confusing, but basically creating C# models in our projects instead of having them in memory or creating a DLL that we have to import into the project. We think that that's the most the clearest way to do it. But that's it's optional. It's up to you how to use it. We tend to find that easiest.
They will be renamed in V9. Callum started a campaign and with a PR.
I believe it's in already.
Lots of people chipped in, and so pure live models will be in memory auto, and app data mode will be source code manual, and then if you want to work in live app data, it will be source code auto. So it's telling you where it's generated, either in memory or source code, and how it's done, either auto or manual, which I think will save 10 minutes off my life every day that I'm training or explaining to developers how to use Umbraco.
Anyway. They are confusing.
So
I don't know if I answered the question, but
I don't know if I asked it. Anyone else opinion on models builder? I quite like stringly type models. I know you said they were like magic strings. I think they're magic, but I quite like prototyping really quickly with stringly type models, and not worrying about generating all the time. But it depends. Again, it goes back to content modeling. Are you content modeling and building a real proof of concept, then refactoring when you know how it's meant to work, or are you trying to build it in one go and walk away?
I think it depends again on what you're trying to do and how much kind of ongoing involvement you have with it. Because if you're building your models with the C# generated classes and Visual Studio project, and then you hand that project over to someone and you walk away from it, making changes to that is basically impossible. You basically said, you need another developer to come in, and a typical user is not going to be able to come in there and make any changes to that. So it again depends on what kind of long-term relationship you see having. That said, as a back-end developer, I would always lean towards saying, I'd like strongly typed models, please. Thank you very much. I'd like to have, a clarity of what type I'm dealing with. I want to know exactly what I'm modeling. I want to know what this data look like and the shape of this data and its relationships and associations. So no easy answer, I'm afraid. It kind of depends on what you want to do, but it's unfortunate that there's no easy way of swapping between modes as well. Not that I'm aware of, at least.
No. I've seen plenty of sites who use Models Builder for a bit, and then also use I publish content stringy type models as well.
Yeah.
On top. But I think it's about context, and if you can type fast and you can spell well, then all good stringy type models, but not every developer can. But I do think there's a disconnect between developers building sites and editors editing them. I think there's this notion that that's how it is, and it's easy to think like that. But actually, there's a whole group of people in the middle who use the Umbraco tool to build websites. And this move to .NET Core, are we thinking about them? Are we only making Uno available for them? And
that's it. Yeah, especially with the NuGet changes as well, because NuGet is now the only way of adding packages to Umbraco. That's going to make it a lot harder for people who want to use a CLI only. Just fire up Visual Studio Code, run .NET New Umbraco. You can't then import packages that create static assets.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to know how many people are still sort of, I call them implementers, implementing sites, doing a bit of code, bit of development, but generally are working in the back office on Umbraco to build a site, and they're not on Umbraco Cloud and they're not on Uno. It'd be really interesting to see, because I'm sure that's a large part of the growth back in the day. But generally don't know the answer. Right, so I think we're coming to an end of this. So, we all practice that song we were all going to do. I'll come in on the second verse. You will start it off one by one. You got a line each, But no, that's a really good talk, and I would like to apologise to anyone whose question I didn't ask or mangled. And I'd like to say thank you to Ronald Morenzi, who was telling me how to say things when it came up with the last techie questions in the notes, which is really good.